First of all, let me welcome everybody here. My name is Peter Holding and I work for Farmers for Climate Action, and it's my pleasure to chair this webinar tonight. Now, first of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners, and as it happens, I live on Wiradjuri land, and I'd like to acknowledge the land on which we work, the traditional owners of our guests that might be here, and our speakers that are joining us. We pay our respects to elders past and present. And I think there's a lot we can learn from our Indigenous community on how to look after the land. So we will now move on. Tonight we'll be using the webinar format. So people attending will be able to put questions if they have any in the Q&A or in the chat. Probably best to use the Q&A section or your question might get lost. You won't be able to speak, or we won't be able to hear you if you do. And we will just have the speakers, and Christy will maybe, if we've got time, have a few questions at the end. But if we don't have the questions at the end, we will record them all anyway and try and get back to you with an answer. So I'd like to thank all our speakers for coming tonight. We are going to look at how to repower our communities, and I noticed today there was some announcements about community batteries, so maybe that'll be in the talk tonight. And we're also going to have to retire our entire coal fleet and replace it with renewable energy. So it'll be a very interesting discussion tonight about how we might go about this, and hopefully many people will think it's important enough to support Helen Haynes's efforts in the House to get her bill passed. Maybe put some pressure on your local members. So I'd like to hand over now to our first speaker, who is Helen Haynes, the member for Indi. She's been a champion of the community renewable energy in her area and across Australia. And her local power agency bill is currently before Parliament, as I just said, and will pave the way for community renewable revolution across Australia. So welcome, Helen.
Thank you so much, Pete. Thanks so much, Peter, and good evening to everyone online. I can see there's 159 people out there, so wherever you are, welcome, and what a delight it is to speak to you. My name is Helen Haynes. I'm the independent federal member for Indi, and I represent 29,000 square kilometres of beautiful northeast Victoria, which includes a large swathe of the Alpine region. And we have 13 community energy groups across Indi, which is a pretty fair representation, actually, when I think about the numbers of community energy groups around the nation. So a strong region who've understood for a long time the real power that we can harness in local communities if we have the levers right to enable that to happen. So yeah, it's a real pleasure for me to speak to you tonight. And as Peter indicated, I've been bringing to the Parliament really a set of bills that would enable a scaling up of community energy in Australia. And before I talk about that, I guess I'll just give a little bit of an overview. I'm not sure where everyone is from, but I know Mark is from Scotland, so I'll just give a bit of an overview of where I'm coming from with this. So as many of you know, over the next 2 decades, around 60% of Australia's coal fleet will retire. And we know that over the same period, the most low-cost pathway to meet our electricity needs is going to be renewables. We know that around 47 gigawatts of new grid-scale renewables will be needed, 21 gigawatts of dispatchable energy, and we'll see a 5-fold increase in distributed solar generation. We also know that this is all happening right in front of us at lightning speed. In 2019, our nation, Australia, installed 6.3 gigawatts of renewable energy. And as my slide says there, that's almost 4 times the size of the Hazelwood Power Station, which, for your benefit, Mark, is a large coal-fired power station, a very old one in Victoria. So if I could have the next slide, please, Claire. Thank you. Around Australia, we've had renewable energy zones identified, and you can see there on that map, it's a bit of a rough representation of where they are. And right now, we know that the renewable energy zones in New South Wales alone have attracted billions of dollars of private investment. And from my perspective as a representative of a regional community, what's abundantly clear to me is that there is an enormous opportunity for the regions to really benefit and harness the opportunity that these renewable energy zones give to us, and to make sure that we look at this transition to renewable energy in Australia as an ideal opportunity for regional development. Next slide, please, Claire. So what we know that even though renewables are happening to us in regional Australia at lightning speed, we're not seeing the full benefit of those renewables. And in fact, in some regional communities, there's some pushback against renewables. And it's largely for the very reason that local people don't see how it will benefit them. What they often see is some negativity around the amenity of those renewable projects. Some people aren't fond of the look of solar farms, aren't fond of the look of wind turbines. But for many people, there's not a clear indication of how those renewables are really going to benefit their community. But many people in the community energy space understand that there is indeed an opportunity to not only benefit financially, but to get some energy security and to really contribute to reducing emissions more broadly. And ultimately too, of course, to have cheaper prices. But right now, the landscape, the legislative landscape in Australia means that there's many barriers to community groups actually scaling up what they want to do. There are some grants available at a federal level, but they tend to be spasmodic. It pits one community group competing against another. Often community organisations are not ready to put in an application when a grant round comes around, and they miss out on opportunities to fund some of the small-scale renewable projects that they want to undertake. We also know at the moment that there is a lack of emphasis from the bigger corporate renewable energy projects on making sure that local people benefit with local jobs, that businesses locally are used for procurement, and that there's some legacy outcomes for local communities. So while there are some good companies doing some good things, it's not a universal experience for regional communities. We also know that with some large corporates setting up large-scale renewable energy projects, that the profits from those projects are sometimes going offshore, and that there's only very occasionally opportunities for local people to invest in those projects if they want to. And finally, we know that in this boom that's happening, that there's not been a targeted investment in local skills development. So we're not seeing our renewable energy industry really investing in developing skills through our TAFEs, making sure that our young people are being trained in new technologies that would enable them to have a future in the renewable energy industry. Next slide, please, Claire. So if we are really to make sure that regional communities benefit from the renewable energies boom, we really need to focus, I believe, and I know many of you on this call believe, we need to give a strong and targeted focus to community energy. And the definition, as many of you will already know, but the definition that we commonly use is that community energy is where everyday people own, develop, or receive tangible benefits from renewable energy projects. And this is what I'm trying to do at a federal level, is to ensure that our federal government and the funding bodies that we create at a federal level make sure that everyday people truly see a benefit. So next slide, please, Claire. So In the midst of the COVID lockdown in the dark winter of 2020, my team set about getting together with local community energy groups around the nation. We set up a 15-member local expert panel of people who know a lot about community energy. We put out a discussion paper to the nation talking about community energy and asked people to make submissions into that process to identify for us what the opportunities were, what the enablers were, what the barriers were to scaling up community energy and to creating a landscape where it could truly flourish. And we found that there were 5 key opportunities to really accelerate community energy in Australia. The first one that we identified was to attract strategic investment capital. We identified that, that it's very difficult for local communities to start up their own community energy projects because they don't have the funds to get going. So they needed start-up capital, essentially. And as I said before, while there are standalone grants from time to time, they don't often come at the time that's most ideal for local communities. We knew that local community energy hubs are a great way to assist communities to get going with a local project if they have the expertise and if in fact they hold some grant funds themselves. We identified that what we probably needed was a centralised agency to really enable capacity building at a federal level. So while we've got more than 100 community energy groups around the nation, a federal agency that could create and disseminate resources was something that we needed. Right now we have AEMO and we have the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, but we don't have anything that's specifically targeted at community energy. We also identified that we needed to introduce a public underwriting scheme to de-risk mid-scale projects, because while we had some good work happening at a small level and some large-scale renewables going on right around the nation, the mid-scale projects seem to be a bit of a missing middle. And we also wanted to, we also identified that community co-investment in large-scale projects needed to be something that happened routinely, not just occasionally. Right now, it's rather rare for communities to have the opportunity to co-invest in a large-scale renewable, and I guess an example of one where that's happening is the Sapphire wind project in New South Wales. Next slide, please, Claire. So in that piece of community engagement work, which went on over several months, we developed a large piece of policy, which I'm really proud of, called the Local Power Plan. And we launched that around, gosh, I think it was around May or June last year. And from that piece of policy work, I took that and spruiked it like crazy around the federal parliament. I spent quite a bit of time talking to members of parliament right across the aisles, many regional MPs. I had several meetings with the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction and a couple of meetings with the Prime Minister to highlight to them that there's a whole piece of work in the energy puzzle that addresses regional development that's completely missing in the Australian federal landscape. And I got a pretty good reception. So what I highlighted to them were the ideas and were the enablers that we could use if the government was so minded to get behind me on this, to not only fund these ideas, but to put in a legislative framework that would embed them. What we clearly needed was a dedicated agency that focused on community energy, and I've called this agency the Australian Local Power Agency, or ALPA. And as I said in the previous slide, this is an agency that would form a trinity alongside AEMO and the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, but its mandate, its focus would be on community energy. Next slide, please, Claire. So the Australian Local Power Agency, or ALPA, would have 3 pillars which would address those issues that we identified in our policy work in 2020. It would capture those 5 key opportunities that I spoke of, and it would really accelerate community energy right across Australia. So the three pillars is firstly the local power scheme, and that's the scheme that would set up and fund community energy hubs right around the nation, and I'm suggesting that we should have 50. And that would pick up on those first three opportunities that I talked about. It would enable that strategic investment in community energy. It would establish these local hubs which would have technical expertise, so we don't have to reinvent the wheel every time we're trying to set up a community energy project. We could share that technical expertise amongst our groups. And it would establish a whole lot of capacity building through those hubs. The second pillar is to pick up on that mid-scale opportunity that I identified as being a missing middle, and that would introduce an underwriting scheme, which I'm calling the Unki scheme, underwriting new community investment, which is akin to the government's current underwriting scheme for large renewables, which they call the Ungi scheme. And the final pillar is what I call the CRIS scheme, the Community Renewable Investment Scheme, which would legislate that all new large-scale renewables set up by corporates would have to make an offer. And it was just an offer. If they couldn't get the buy-in, that's okay. The project could continue, but they must make an offer of up to 20% sharing, community sharing in revenues. Next slide, please, Claire. So this is not just a pie in the sky idea. It's not something that Helen Haynes has dreamt up, far from it. As I indicated before, this is the brain power of community energy groups right around the nation who worked closely with me on this, and I'm so grateful to all of you who've contributed to this. Many of you are on this line. We know from the work that's happened before, from the pilot work that's happened in Victoria, that investing in such community energy initiatives truly drives economic activity in the regions. And we know in Victoria, a similar pilot scheme had a 13-fold return on investment. And we've done the modelling on this. If the ELPA scheme, if the legislation that I've introduced to Parliament was enacted and this actually happened, we know from the work that we've done with the Parliamentary Budget Office that we could potentially generate over $4 billion of economic activity for the regions. That's pretty exciting to me. As a regional Australian, you know, I think about the booms we've had in the past. I think about, you know, the gold rush. I think about the wool boom. And I think that right now renewable energy is our potential economic prosperity boom if only we truly got behind this with the right kind of legislation. Next slide, please, Claire. So this is it really. This is the Australian Local Power Agency Bill. I introduced it into Parliament in February. I was delighted to have many people who contributed to the policy work in the House of Representatives when I introduced it. Christy was certainly there. And it was a real thrill to me to have so many people represented from community energy join me on the floor of the House of Reps, and then at a large media conference afterwards, where folks got the chance to actually speak to the why of this and to show the nation really the potential that's sitting there for us if we get behind this in a way that can truly scale this up for the nation. So. You know, I often give the example about what we see in other nations, and if we just take Germany as one example, and we know that in Germany, 10% of all renewable energy projects are owned by farmers, and we know that another 30% is owned by local communities. And when I think about that in Australia, where the regions have faced years of drought, floods in some places most recently. We face all sorts of challenges with border closures and the peccadillos of rural life. But to have the opportunity to truly prosper, to have money coming into the pockets of regional Australians for every electron that comes out of our regions, I think truly could be a game changer in Australia. So that's what I'm trying to do. I'd love to have your support. Those of you who are listening, if you could get on the bandwagon and make contact with your local MP, whoever she or he is, encourage them to have a look at this work. I've been really, really delighted that just before I left Canberra last week, the Parliamentary Committee for Energy and Environment accepted this bill for an inquiry, which is a bit of a coup. I'm pretty happy about that. We'll let you know when the time comes that you could make submissions to that, but that's, again, a really good step in making this a reality. So that's all from me. Thanks so much for the opportunity to speak to you tonight.
Thanks, Helen. We're right on time, so we'll keep pushing because we've got a fair bit to do. I'd just like to let people know that Helen has to leave at 7:30, so we'll try and get any questions directed to her back through Christy later. But thanks, Helen, for your efforts. I think the community widely appreciate them, even well outside of Indi, so thank you. Now I'll move on to our next speaker, which is Mark Hull. Now, Mark is the ex-CEO of the Community Energy Scotland, and he is an expert in community energy. He's going to talk to us tonight about Community Energy Scotland, what CE has achieved, and how the government support helped that sector. So I hand over to Mark.
Hi. Well, thank you, Peter. I'm just having slightly issues sharing my screen, but there we go. I'm in, no bother. Hopefully now you can see that on the screen. Right, sorry. Yeah, thank you very much for the invite. I was asked basically to do a bit of a description of community energy in Scotland and the sort of experience over the last 20 years, really. Let's get a clip, sorry. Yeah, so I'm head of innovation. Sadly, I'm not ex-CEO. Well, no, I wouldn't want to be the CEO. I've come to it from the other way, but I'm one of the senior management with Community Energy Scotland. I'm really fortunate that I can stay and I work and live in my home, which is in Orkney, with the islands of the north coast of Scotland. It's a long time since I've done a UI here map, because I don't think I've left the front room for about a year. But I mean, yeah, so basically for those that don't know, if you have the United Kingdom and Scotland, and you go right to the top, there's a set of islands, which are called Orkney Islands, which is where I live and work and have been brought up, and I've been lucky to do that. I started as a volunteer on an island where we faced social challenges, population challenges, financial ones, and I got involved in volunteering and set up a community organisation which saw the opportunity of putting up turbines, and kind of poacher turned gamekeeper. And I took 2 years out from my main job to go and do that, and it's 15 years later. I'm still doing this with Community Energy Scotland, but that's great. And Community Energy Scotland, we're an independent charity. We have a core purpose to build confidence, resilience, and wealth at community level in Scotland through sustainable energy development. And we in some degrees, as Helen was speaking about, were the energy agency, I suppose. I mean, we were working in the Highlands and the islands, and we had an opportunity to do this for the Scottish Government. We have about 20 staff spread across Scotland at the moment, including 10 in Orkney at the moment, where there's a phenomenal amount of energy on some new energy systems and work on batteries, but not for discussion today. We're a member-based organisation, so we set ourselves up with over 400 members. Most of those are mostly non-profit distributing community groups. But we've supported over 1,500 community energy projects over the last 2 decades. And they're now worth over 5 million a year to local people for income and affordable energy and for doing things like this. And these activities, from the small to the biggest, they support communities, their facilities, creating places and reasons to gather, thrive and work together is what we set out to do. As I say, back in the noughties, we got the contract with the Scottish Government to help and support communities. Doing this across Scotland, I say over 1,500 projects in 10 years. It was a very build out phase. The Scottish Government recognised the value at a governmental level, and in many ways it's like a state level to invest. As you say, Helen, we reckon and we see between 10 and 20 times return on what the government put in that's generated from those projects. And they put in 20 million grant. They put the money where their mouth was, and we put in that grant. And that was accompanied by advice and support. And that was split between capital projects and technical and capacity building projects. And it was called the CARE scheme, a great acronym. But yeah, so from that point of view, it's a wide range of technologies across a range of, the predominance of wind because of wind and water because of our climate, but equally with ground source heat pumps and biomass and things like that. With the key emphasis of adding and retaining local value, everything I think that a lot of what you're trying to do chimes with. I say more recently we've worked on partnership with communities. We stopped doing the Scottish Government contract in 2014, and we actually work in partnership with them, and we've done about over 50 million worth of new sort of smart energy system projects where we try and get more value and retain more value. Now we've built the generation, how do we keep more value in the energy system, and so our local communities can benefit from it? But that's for another day. Really for today, it was really to give you a flavour of what this build out programme did and what it meant to Scotland and the communities from that point of view. It was split, and it's split into two types. The quite small scale, we say the facility-based energy installations. These are typically smaller projects, often volunteer groups, but could be social enterprises, and making core community buildings and spaces more sustainable and usable. This is like a community hall with a small wind turbine, and they had terrible running costs and things like that, and it let them afford to get insulation, and then they doubly help themselves because they sort out the building and they make it more sustainable and more usable. So it was really at that level. And over 1,000 projects were supported at that over the period. But then as it was evolving, we're recognizing the opportunity of revenue generating projects, as we saw at that time, as the renewable sector was maturing in Scotland and the UK, and the communities got involved in this. And these are usually much larger projects, as you say, operating commercially. They're normally owned in the community centre by non-profit distributing member-based community social enterprises that we work with, but then also more and more that became local landowners and local ownership as the thing evolved, and I'll touch on that later. But they mostly earn revenue from community funds, which then could be used to address things. Westry is one of the first ones, and I'll touch on that later, was in Orkney. That's just a typical 900 kilowatt turbine, over 150 across Scotland. They're mostly now operational, and more coming with a question mark. It's interesting, we're in a bit of a lull now and looking to see how we take this forward at the moment, after significant build out. And I think the really key thing for that, for Scotland and ourselves, was an early recognition of the value of ownership for community revenue. And there's just a very simple graph that we just used to use and describe for both the opportunity of wholly own it as a community, but also as joint ventures and buy-ins. Because it's almost common sense, it's almost a given, but you have to sometimes just really state it. The amount of community benefit increases the degree of ownership and control that the community have over their renewable energy development. In Scotland, the Scottish Government were reasonably progressive. They brought in a guidance, and for private developers that would recognise that you should be expecting to aim at £5,000 per megawatt installed to be given to be doing this community as a standard. There wasn't a standard for years and years, and they brought this in to try and encourage and make sure we were embedding some of that value in the local communities. But we knew if we put it up ourselves, as a minimum, we get 100,000. So that's 20 times direct value just in cash from owning it rather than benefiting from it and getting what effectively became community benefit. And community benefit itself has issues in its own right, because it's a matter of ownership and control and what you do with that money if it's something that's not yours, I think. But also the indirect value. The New Energy Economic Foundation talk about the LM3 effect, which is local money 3. If you take money and keep it in your community 3 times, what does it mean? If you have 80% of that money and you keep it in it changes hands 3 times, it's worth 64 times more than only if you keep 20%. It sounds crazy, but it's simple maths, but it really works. And it's really powerful that by keeping that money in your local community. And equally, and there's a lot more formal work on external multipliers and things like this, that £1 retained and just spent, not owned, and usually was worth about 7 times to the multipliers of how that filters through and how we use it within our own communities. But I would say the caveat is that the cold side of this is higher reward is usually linked to larger requirements to take responsibility and risk associated with that development that may counteract some of the benefits. So there is, as you go over, there's nothing for nothing in that way. So the reward matches the risk. But I think recognizing that strength, a lot of the work was done either by government agencies, ourselves, and individual communities to identify how we could maximize that ownership factor. And a lot of things that Helen's proposing, and there's also, I see from the activities of yourselves and other ones, is identifying things like that early involvement. If you have early involvement, you get to create value and create larger amount of ownership early on when you're doing that. Real ownership, if you're in a joint venture, is making sure it's not just some sort of arms that are handed out in that sense, but it's actually, it works best when the risk and reward is proportionate, and it's not almost just like a sweetener, because actually long term you get better from actually having more active ownership, and that allows more equitability and benefit distributed through structures like social enterprises and things like that to help make sure it's fair and collective. And you can justify it, especially in this local context. A lot of what you're having to do is justify to your neighbours, your relations, your friends. It's not some abstract thing, and I think that's really important. And self-administration where possible, even sometimes where you didn't even own the turbine, but you were dealing with the funds that you're coming off that. Ownership of benefit becomes really important. You have a little opportunity to own a bit of your future. And I think I touched on that with some examples. So yeah, back in 2009, we were all very inspired by a very early adopter island called Gia that put up the Dancing Ladies, the three turbines back in 2005. And we started to adopt this across the Highlands Islands of Scotland. And by 2009, there was two other, the one in Orkney called Westry and one on another island called Tiree. And that was inspiring more and more folk. It became like a snowball effect. So by 2012, just 3 years later, not only do we have people looking at this, and these are landowners and communities all over Scotland looking to develop these projects, more and more were coming online, and they're being led by these early examples. And in particular, Orkney, which is where I really came in for that point of view, and five particular groups in Orkney. So we had the Westry project there up and running, but very quickly on the back of that, 5 other islands identified the opportunity and worked and were supported by the learning we'd got and by other interventions. So we had these 5 wholly owned turbines that went up by 2012. But also, quite unusually at that time, the local authority, the council, basically took a joint venture and took joint ownership of a 5 megawatt site, and the community had an opportunity to take 10% of a commercial one on one of the islands of Sandy. But very quickly, we had more than 7 megawatt installed in Orkney, and that became a significant factor for economically and for what we were doing. And this is Rousey, this is my island. It was not my island, it's my island I stay on. And this is literally the first day of that turbine turning. And it was a poor day, but it's a great day because it was a good day for the wind. And I literally leant on the turbine and took the photos and said, and this film and said, it's a revolution. £2,500 we earned in that first day just by that turbine turning. And then you can see the thing going, flashing away there. It was just phenomenal. And after a huge amount of work to get there back in 2011. But when we say we got there, we hadn't really got there. We've actually just started the work. We've just got the thing built, and now we can actually do things with it. For Orkney and for those turbines we talked about, we're talking about over 4 million per annum coming in revenue, as Helen was touching on. 1.5 of that after cost. So that's the sort of margin we're making. And that's worth 30 million in today's money, in 2011 money for those projects over the lifetime. It's a lot of money to work with and work across your communities. So we started to do it. Rousey, we carried on what we were doing with improving shared facilities and combating fuel poverty. We have a lot of issues to do with housing quality and cost of fuel and things in the islands. But it started to grow and more on that. And then enhanced home care and support for a lot of us was to keep folk in the community. We have there, which I have the old Dr Firth. She's 103. They're John Garson, a farmhand at that time with his newborn kid, and make sure both that young families could come and stay in there and have jobs, which we could support, and that people could stay in their homes and be supported by their family and those that know them and surround them. And that was a key thing that we were looking to do. And we gave more than the state would give because we saw that as a priority. And even simple things. Early on, we're improving roads. Out in islands, it's really costly to get stone chips and things like that. So we subsidised it to make sure the islands weren't penalised, or the community wasn't penalised. And that came so literally we were paving the roads around us and keeping us on the road from that point of view. And things like other infrastructure, internet connections and things like that, and maintaining local fuel supply and services. We all rely very heavily still on a local shop with a fuel pump, and we replace the pump and do things like this. But we also had other ambitions, and this was like funding growing spaces. I mean, important in Orkney, very different from probably most of you are. We actually we need to keep all the sun we can and trap it, and out of season. And this was this was us funding and skinning up a polytunnel for that as a community polytunnel that's both used by individuals and the community to grow stuff. And other things like that, travel and mobility, where we are, sometimes we can't provide the activity or the services we want in our community, but if we support others to travel to the place that do it, it enables you to stay where you are. And simple things like that. And likewise, we identified open skills training support. We didn't have an agenda. We have a plan, we have things, but we recognized very early, if you encourage people to follow their ambition and their dream and their interest, is often the best way that to actually generate enterprise and interest is through this training report. And we have an open-ended budget that we use to do that. and this is in the community. And we created a craft organisation. It's funny, we didn't expect that much of it, but a third of that island community contribute and get some revenue through the craft hub now, which is phenomenal from a point of view. And then other things, cultural things, we have years of, we've done heritage, we've done sport, we've done everything that we can to keep interest, keep culture, keep things alive, and on and on. 10 years in, I know we've just gone through COVID, and for example, the Rousey Exeter Development Trust, we supported folk when folk were trapped in their homes. We laid on transport. We did a hot Meals on Wheels every day, so people got fish and chips on a Friday and things like this. And we did all the things to allow people to stay in their homes in a time of real extremes that hopefully we never see again. So that was it, and that was a real example of an Orkney from that point we're doing. But just taking it back out to a wider picture in Scotland and tying back in with how you're thinking today, where we've been then, we built back 2011, 2012, and what's really happened then. And in Scotland, we've had a decade further of growth. Interestingly, tying in from what you were hearing here as well, it's shifting more towards joint ownership and local buy-in, and that's the way the industry and the technology and the finances are evolving. Scotland, we met the 2020 target of 500 megawatts in 2015. So the Scottish government doubled it. Not scared of a challenge from that point of view. By the end of 2020, they didn't quite get there. So 853 megawatt installed and just missed the new target. But there's another 900 megawatts in development in a period of 1 to 5 years, and they should easily overshoot that target quite significantly. But again, as Helen was talking about, looking at we've actually got a very high percentage of farm and estate owned, whereas more than a third is actually primarily owned by farmers and estates. And then depending how you add it up on the community side, between a third and half then are owned by community anchor organisations or non-profit distributing organisations. And the split's interesting, strongly wind, but also things like biomass and others are becoming much more significant. So yeah, so this was our target. We didn't quite make the line, but I think that was the key thing to say, that near completion, the shared ownership, as we're just in a contractual position, there's a huge chunk, over half a gigawatt is sitting there that'll be community and locally owned, where they've bought into the larger schemes as that industry has evolved and matured over Scotland. And if we don't have time, and I don't even want to try the technology, but if you have a chance to look at the surface, it's a really, really good example where a community have come together. The Glenurk and Strathglass have come together with a landowner, with two brothers who are very sort of forward-thinking and inspired, and they've got a joint venture where they've combined both the turbine, the revenue from the turbine, and what they do as a community thing. And there's a lovely video there on that for you to see that. So that's really me. I was discussing with Christy, what is the recipe for success? It's really quite a hard question in so many ways, but I think early pre-market government energy targets and capital support have to be in there. I think it is really key. And I think that state regional recognition of the value of community activity is there. It's really helped us. And as we've gone forward, we've sort of got what's the essence of that? And is this initial local enablement, advice and capacity building, whether it's your individual people who have the land or community organisations or those who want to take it forward, putting yourself on the tracks to be able to actually go ahead and develop, I think is an absolutely key thing. And de-risking that at-risk early stage of development. Communities, we had nothing, we didn't have 2 pennies to run together in Rousey, but this was the thing that let us get underway and develop something of value just by developing it, just by getting permissions, just by doing that feasibility. And for the landowners, it was recognised quite early that they did a no-risk loan, the Scottish Government did, where until you got planning permission, until you got to that point, if you failed, you wouldn't pay back the loan. So they de-risked it from that point of view. But once you got your permitting and you got value on this site, then you were able to pay it back. And that was a really good approach for it. And the same thing as that is underwriting, the cash flowing, that post-permitting, because you get all your permission, and then suddenly you've got to get the investors, you've got to get all that signed off, and there's that gap and that lull in the middle of the projects, which is really hard. And supporting real buy-in and joint venture as that came about, as that activity became more and more predominant, we recognised we didn't want it just to be lip service. We didn't want it just to be something that was actually sort of another form of community benefit. It was recognised that the local people had true value and responsibility as well as opportunity from that joint venture. A wider recognition of the value and resistance of local resilience in the times of COVID, but also just as we see with more extreme weather and things like this, the value of having embedded generation is now value to the grid operators. The grid operators see this, and they actually now in a lot of Scotland will use those local generators to keep the lights on, where before they would have relied on the coal plant in Edinburgh is our equivalent, Helen, previously up until that point. And we're now working on it. It's really just the final bit of the slide. I think we need to really value that second generation to get it recognised, because we're not interested in handouts. We want to say we're doing our own bit and we're getting paid and we're getting justified and resourced for doing that. So the work that comes on having these local ownership, the legacy, the indirect activities, the community anchor organisations, which it underpins, that keep the playgroup going, keep the sports facilities going, and all those sort of things are really, really important. And we find that, and we want to say that and go back to government and say, hey, we're doing this. You resource us and make sure we're part of the picture. And the thing I used to, as we go around the room, I'd say for yourself and the recipe of success, I was going to say, we normally say your answer is most likely in this room, but today's maybe on the Zoom. We're now at that kind of situation. I think in the end, it's not going to be a Scottish answer. It's going to be an answer of all the people on it. You'll get your heads together and you'll find the things that works for your own situations and your own communities. Oh yeah, sorry, that was it. And I'm probably have run over now. I just love simplicity. It's funny, Christy was saying the same. I love an image. Am I okay, Peter? This is my last slide.
Thank you, Mark. That was a great talk, and I think a lot of people will have got a lot out of that.
Yes.
We'll keep pushing on because we're running out of time.
Sorry.
Our next speaker is David Marston and John Clark, and they have organised community energy groups in Gloucester and Shoalhaven. That's Energise Gloucester and Repower Shoalhaven. And they will give some context on their local community energy groups and how federal energy policy could help them. So I hand over to David and John. Thank you. David, your microphone's off. If we can.
Yeah. Is that better? You can hear me now?
That's better.
Yep, okay. David Marston from Energise Gloucester Incorporated. Gloucester is a community of about 5,000 people, 2 hours northwest of Newcastle. We're about an hour from any other major town, so in that sense somewhat isolated, but about 4 years ago, Gloucester held a sustainability workshop forum over a weekend, and Energise Gloucester was one of the ideas that came out of that. There were 3 or 4 other ideas that started, but I think to boast a little bit, Energise Gloucester is the one that has succeeded because it was able to get a focus and get some runs on the board. We formed a committee, we got incorporated, we set up some aims, and very briefly, the 5 aims are to help Gloucester people, households, use energy more efficiently and reduce their energy costs, to enable clean, affordable, renewable energy sources for people in the district, to increase the diversity of enterprises that are using renewable energy, to create job opportunities, that's been the most difficult one, and support community networks through renewable energy and efficiency projects. The creating job opportunity one, I said the most difficult. Another part of our background was a huge battle between coal and coal seam gas development in the valley, and the great push that jobs drove that process. And as you all know, renewable energy doesn't necessarily create a lot of jobs, but it does create income and assets in other ways. We set about a range of tasks, starting off with the usual sort of educational type tasks. I think we're quite lucky in having a committee that had quite a wide brains trust, and this has been quite important. The people on the committee, as Mark was saying, the answer's often in the room, and we've been able to drive quite a lot with that brains trust. A certain degree of retirees moving to the countryside, and Gloucester's certainly been a recipient of that, which has been fantastic. We were then able to develop a small, only a 100 kilowatt, a 30 kilowatt system, sorry, a 30 kilowatt system on the neighbourhood centre. They were large energy users and it impacted severely on their budget. We were able to raise community funds, put a solar system on their roof, and in 3 years, they bought back the ownership of that, and we were able to repay the investors within the community. And that's been a great boost to our morale, but also to our focus within the community. We've now got over 100 members of Energise Gloucester, and 2 years ago, we put in an application to the state government to build a 500 kilowatt solar farm. We were successful in getting about $500,000 from the state government for that project. And we're about to go to the community and raise the other $500,000. We formed a cooperative to do that as a limited company that can sell shares and distribute dividends, which Energise Gloucester itself wasn't able to do. So we've now got the Gloucester Solar Community Cooperative, which will be owning and operating the solar farm. We've just gone out to a tender on that. As I said, we had a huge brains trust in the committee and we thought that we could probably work it through ourselves, but earlier this year we realised we needed some technical assistance and we've contracted a technical providing company which has helped us a huge amount in terms of getting a better focus and helping us go out to tender for the project. It should be built towards the end of this year and start generating next year, which then leads, of course, to the problem of how do you sell the electricity in New South Wales, and that is a state issue, not a federal issue, but the state requirements are quite severe in terms of how you can sell electricity, basically, unless you're behind the meter, which was the neighbourhood system, where at the neighbourhood centre we had the panels on their property and we sold it to their meter before it went into the grid system. With the community solar farm, it's too big for any of that in Gloucester because we don't have a large user within the vicinity of our community. So we're going to have to sell to the grid and that puts all sorts of constraints on it. So we're working through ways of maximising the income to the cooperative. And the reason for that is twofold. One, that we've got an objective of social access where we will provide relief for people's energy bills in some form or other to lower socioeconomic households. And so a proportion of the income after costs will be used for that social access component, and the other, of course, is to pay a dividend to the $500,000 shareholders in the community. So we're working through how that can occur. We are in a position where Gloucester's electricity comes on a bit of a loop line from the main supply. It's 11,000 kilowatt system, but it's a bit of a loop system. So generation out on the ends of the network is quite important to the distributor, but not recognised in any financial way, other than to say, yes, they're glad to have these systems along the line. So we'll be feeding into 11,000 kV line and working out how we can maximise that income. So, yeah, I think that's probably covered it. Oh, except to say that, interestingly, we're actually not part of any of the renewable energy zones that have been set up. So we haven't gained anything from those by way of either finance or technical support. But I think it's a great example of how a community of 5,000 people can start the process that Mark talked about in terms of how far they've gone. But we're only 3 years into this, and I think it's working well. Thank you.
Thanks, David. I'll hand over to John.
Thanks, Peter, and hi, everyone. My name's John Clark. I'm the Deputy Chair of Repower Shoalhaven. We're a social enterprise, a not-for-profit community organisation that's been running for about 6 years now, based in Shoalhaven area on the south coast of New South Wales. And our purpose, our mission, if you like, is to develop or to facilitate renewable energy projects in this region. And so over the last 6 years, our focus in the first 4 years was on providing a means by which businesses and community organisations could go solar when they didn't have the funds necessarily to be able to invest in a solar power system. So essentially putting solar panels on the roofs of their buildings. So we sought to tackle that by going out and getting investment from the community, and using that investment, we signed up a deal with the customers so that we would provide the investment required to purchase the system, invest in that system, and then we would sell that electricity to them over a 10-year period using a power purchase agreement. And at the end of that 10-year period, the ownership of the system reverts to the customer. So that's a model that worked, particularly in the early days when there weren't many others out there offering that sort of power purchase agreement arrangement. We've done about 22 projects, mainly in the Shoalhaven area, and they're on small and medium-sized businesses and community organisations. So in that process, we've raised some $1 million, a little over $1 million, and the number of kilowatts is around about 1,200 kilowatts combined. Around about 2 years ago, a little longer than that, we thought that an appropriate direction to move in was to develop a solar farm. And after doing a lot of work identifying sites, speaking to the local council here and developing up a model, it seemed to us that the best way forward was to try and identify an industry partner, a renewable energy provider out there that had the size, that would be able to invest funds in being able to build a solar farm, to take most or all of the power, and effectively to de-risk the project. But our focus was also, what we wanted to do was ensure as much of that power was going to then be consumed locally for the benefit of initially local businesses, and then in due course, we'd like to see subsequent solar farms developed that were able to sell the power to smaller businesses and indeed to residents. So that's the focus that we've taken. And another component of it is to, like with the power purchase agreements with and the solar panels on the roofs of businesses, we want to give investors, local investors, an opportunity to invest in this particular project so that they have a stake. In due course, we would like to be in a position where we could take equity in some of these projects as well. But that's something that remains to be seen. And we think that that's a really important element, and it goes to some of the things that Mark was talking about to enable us to become a more sustainable organisation as a result of doing that. And so what we're able to bring to the table, and this may help with other existing or nascent community energy groups out there, is that we've been able to leverage our stakeholder relationships, including with the local council and with the community, And we've found that in working with one particular industry partner, that that's a very marketable commodity. They look for those sorts of things when they then go and sell the power to some of their customers, including state and local government organisations, often in capital cities. So moving on then to what we'd like to see with federal policy or indeed state policy and financial support. I guess we give the largest hail out there for what Helen Haynes was talking about, the local power plan framework. We feel that if that framework were to be implemented and the various things that Helen spoke about there, using that model that was developed in Victoria to develop the hubs, we think that that would be not only good for this region, but good for all regions across Australia. In particular, it's that underwriting capability and the ability to contribute dollars to a project so that those community groups can have some equity in those projects. Another element here in New South Wales, and this is something that David touched on, is the renewable energy zones. We're not real sure whether the Shoalhaven is included in this gargantuan Hunter, Central Coast and Wollongong regional, renewable energy zone, but we're endeavouring to see if we are part of that. But if that program were to be broadened, it enables the fast tracking of decision making, of planning, and would incentivise investment. And another element that we would like to see, whether this comes from the federal government or from state government, would be funding for batteries. We don't at this stage have a battery as part of this nascent solar farm project that we've been working on, but it certainly, if there were to be a battery, it will boost the local outcomes by enabling local organisations and indeed residents to be able to use that power when the sun isn't shining, to also sell into the grid as may be, and also to sell those security services. So I guess I'd finish by saying that Helen spoke before of all of these really large solar farm projects and wind projects and the like, but that needs to be complemented with local projects that have a focus on serving local customers. And if you think about it, it really dovetails with the distributed power network, which is a desired outcome that organisations like AEMO and many other people who are experts in this field have spoken about. So yeah, so we'd encourage other community energy groups out there to lend as much effort as they could, and really to back in that local power plan that Helen has advanced.
Thank you, John. We're just pretty much running to time, a little bit late. I'll hand over to Christy Walters now. She's leading the Community Power Agency campaign. And Christy will talk about how community energy fits into the bigger picture, outline the Renew Our Community strategy, what they're planning on targeting elections and the lead up to the budget and the elections. And Christy will also wrap up and talk about next steps. Over to you, Christy.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Peter. And thanks to, well, all the speakers really, in really painting a picture of what community energy is like overseas and in lots of smaller communities in Australia. So what I wanted to talk about, and I'll keep it brief because I know we've been going for a little while, is really the Repower Our Communities campaign, which you all would have seen in the emails, and what the strategy is for that. I guess there's 3 things that I want to talk about. So why does community energy matter? And that'll just be briefly, because lots of folks have already addressed that, so that's excellent. Just to outline the campaign and how you can get involved. So it's already been touched on quite a lot, but for me, the key thing that brings it all together is community energy is really key to the transition to renewable energy for the whole country. And that's because, well, we've got lots of individual action with people putting solar panels on their own household and doing other energy efficiency things in their own household. And we've got some large scale things happening. There's sort of this middle ground that's missing, and there's a real opportunity in that space to bring people along. And one of the reasons why community energy can do that is because it's really tangible. We just heard 2 great examples of what's happening in Gloucester and in the Shoalhaven, with how these projects are already operating and people are getting benefits, whether that's a reduced electricity bill for their community organisation, or even dividends from being an investor in one of the projects. Having these projects located in communities across Australia makes them more understandable and can bring people along the journey to getting the whole country to 100% renewable energy, because there's quite a few steps between where we are now and where we need to get to. And getting involved in community energy can really kind of build people's understanding of what our energy system is like and where we need to get to, particularly around the transmission that's going to need to come in to enable a lot of the large scale projects to go ahead. And just to, I guess, touch on briefly, a few folks have mentioned the renewable energy zones that are happening at the state level in Australia. So Helen showed that map where there's renewable energy zones in pretty much every state and territory of Australia, which is really excellent. And they're focused mostly on enabling large-scale energy developments to happen, which is wonderful, but there's a real risk, and I think Helen was highlighting this really well, that these projects can go ahead and the benefits don't necessarily feed back into the local communities where they're located. So we really need to make sure that can happen. And indeed, one of the schemes that she was talking about, the community investment scheme, is where large scale developments would need to offer at least 20% of their whole kind of ownership model to community investors. So that's one way that people can be involved in a community energy kind of space like that. The other thing to mention is, why should we be doing this now? As most folks on this call will know, we have a coalition government led by Scott Morrison. And as you probably all know, there's no climate or renewables policy at the federal level. And so there's a massive gap right now for how we're going to actually get on with this transition to clean energy. And so we've got an opportunity when we know that there's more renewable energy coming. We know that communities in Australia really love renewables. And so there's kind of just this missing piece of connecting them both. And with our coalition government, and there could be an election anytime from the beginning of August, but with things as they are at the moment, it's probably going to be next year. But we know the coalition government is focused on the economic recovery and jobs and very tangible things. And we can see that community energy, when it's supported with investment, can have up to a 10-fold flow-on benefit effect. So it's a really great way to get national and Liberal MPs to support taking action on climate through supporting community energy projects that can filter in the economic benefits to regional communities and employ people locally through doing, energy efficiency audits or putting more solar on people's rooftops through community solar bulk buy, for instance. So those are kind of the reasons, why we think this is really important to get on with now. And this is really the campaign goal. We wanted to make it simple and so that it's easy to communicate with, everyone that you talk to. And so it's really to establish 20 community power hubs across Australia to support communities to power themselves with renewable energy. And so this really dovetails in with the first scheme that the local power plan is suggesting, which is she's calling them the local power hubs. We've chosen community power hubs as there's a few happening in Victoria. There might be a few more coming in the coming months, really. And so it's already an approach that has been tried and tested, and we know it works. We just need to roll this out at a kind of a federal level in every state and territory. So that's the key ask, really. And these hubs would be providing the capacity building that, Mark so eloquently touched on, saying this is really where the key is at, providing that on-ground support to get communities started or progressing their community energy ideas, and also to provide the grant funding for that kind of early pre-feasibility work to really kind of prove the concept of projects that they want to do. So then the key part for this is, all right, how do we win it? So the pathway to win is to leverage the political momentum that's happening at the moment with Helen Haynes' local power bill. And so the reason why we're calling this campaign Repower Our Communities, I'll touch on a little bit later, but also now, is because as Helen Haynes is an independent federal MP, and it's really great that she's kind of co-designed the whole local power plan and is, putting this through Parliament, there's little chance that a private member, which is what an independent is classed as, would get a bill passed through Parliament, being, one voice versus the majority coalition government and then Labor. So what we're seeking to do is to tell the positive story of the economic potential of community energy and what it's already doing, and also use case studies of what could happen, and really focus on the Nationals and then the Liberal MPs to show them this story, to show what it could do in their electorate and how voters in their electorate, are seeking this to happen. Then often is the case that if enough of the government or the opposition MPs think it's a good idea, then they often say, well, I've had this other idea, how about we do this? And they just slightly change the wording, and then it gets up through a different channel. So what our, I guess, strategy is to focus on 4 key electorates that have Nationals MPs or are extremely marginal. So we've chosen Gippsland and Mallee in Victoria, and Lyne and Eden Monaro in New South Wales. They all have Nationals MPs except for Eden Monaro, which is a very marginal seat. And so all kind of MPs and candidates of any political persuasion will be trying to win that. So we can show that this is what communities want to have happen. There's already quite a number of community energy groups in all of these electorates. So if we can kind of band together, tell our politicians that this is what we think would be useful for our communities to build the community resilience, to create more economic opportunities, then we can, they'll see that this is something that could potentially win them votes and they'll get behind it. So that's kind of the strategy in a nutshell. And the rough timeline is to email your MP to repower our community. So we'll be sending out a follow-up email tomorrow with an email action that you can jump on and do that. And then in the coming weeks, we'll be sending emails about a social media action that we'd love everyone to jump on board with. So stay tuned for that one. In May, as Helen mentioned, the local power plan bill got referred to the Energy and Environment Committee. And so we'll be supporting folks to do submissions into that process, just to kind of, create more momentum that there's people right around the country that want to see more support for community energy. And then of course we've got the federal budget happening in May also. So we'll probably do something around that, but still deciding exactly what. And I guess the whole part of this is we're really keen to make this as grassroots as possible. So really it's, take the Repower Our Communities hashtag and run with it. make signs, make cupcakes, you know, talk about it however you can to make sure that there's lots of attention around this idea. And so in July, we'll be kind of asking you all what you think that you might be able to do in your local area. One of those might be meeting your MP, and we'll be supporting folks to do that. And also helping you all do some local media stories if that's something of interest. And then in August, that's probably when the committee will report on their results. So we'll be organising a delegation to go to Parliament to speak to some of those key MPs, and possibly more, depending on how much support we've got. And then at that point, we should know if there's going to be an election this year, ideally. And so we'll do a bit of a reassessment and figure out what the plan is from there. But that's just like kind of the next couple of months. So just a few other things to focus on. I mentioned that we're focusing on using the Repower Our Communities sort of frame rather than the local power plan. And that's really just to show, you know, exactly what we want. We want our federal government to repower our communities with funding and capacity building through the community power hubs. And it also isn't like another way for Liberal and Nationals MPs to really get behind it, because it's not supporting another MPs that's not in their party, which they're very reticent to do. And so throughout this, we're trying to focus on the positive benefits of renewables and community energy. So not necessarily saying we don't want coal or we need to do it because of X, Y, Z. It's more, look at the opportunity that we have in front of us. We know renewables are coming. This is how we can benefit in our community. You know, the play group that's at the end of my street, I know that sometimes they struggle with money, and perhaps one thing that could help them is if they had solar on their rooftop. So perhaps the community could get together to help fund that, and then they might be able to employ another childcare worker to help them out. So that's, you know, kind of sharing stories like that, which is really helpful in painting the picture of how this can actually benefit communities. So the last thing that I'll finish on is the key bit on how to get involved. So as I mentioned, we'll be sending a follow-up email tomorrow with the email your MP action. So it'd be great if everyone can do that. Wherever you are talking about it, use the hashtag Repower Our Communities, you know, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, wherever you're active, you know, talk about why you want to repower your community, and let's get some interest happening around this. So we're working on a website that'll have other bits and pieces on it. And one of the things that will be on there is a section that says who's with us. And so we're really keen to showcase the wide variety of people that want to see this sort of stuff happening and that would love to get more support in their area. So if you're from a group or an organisation, send us your logo and we'll pop it up on the website so we can really just show the spread of people keen for this. And the other thing also we're chasing is some high resolution photos of people in your community, because we want to really show that, you know, this is, you know, of the people for the people kind of thing. So we'd love to showcase a photo of you with a successful community energy project that you've done, or a meeting that you've had where you want to be doing this. Yeah, get in touch with photos and we'll pop them up on the website and use them in our social media. And then the final thing is, I mentioned we're keen to see what your ideas are. So in the coming months, we'll be coordinating a campaign network where you can come along and have we'll be kind of breaking it down into geographic areas to really support you folks to do local actions, whether that be meeting with your MP or doing some other kind of vibrant action to show that folks in your area are really keen to support this campaign. So stay tuned on the emails for what that might look like. And yeah, I might pause it there. And I know that there was lots of questions, so we probably won't have time to address all of those, but the key thing to say is we'll be sending out a recording of this, so the slides will be in that. And yeah, get in touch with any other questions you have about that campaign. We'll go through the questions that have popped up today and do our best to answer those, but there's been quite a few, so it's very exciting that folks are so engaged in this issue. Yeah, so I might pause it there and hand back over to Peter.
Thanks, Christy. Yeah, those questions, some have been answered already by people answering them as they've gone, so that's a start. But there will be we'll keep a list of those and try and get an answer back to the people that are worrying. I'm not too sure what Mark's situation is going to be, whether he can answer. There's a few good questions in there about Scotland and what they've done, but I guess that can be organised through emails or something. So thanks everybody for attending, and thanks to Christy and Helen for organising this. And I think that's it for the evening. Everybody can go home and have a think about everything that's been said tonight. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks everyone for coming along.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, David. Thanks, John.
Thank you.